Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for tuning in and for connecting with the Pennsylvania Game Commission to learn more about the northern bobwhite quail. My name is Crescinda, and along with my colleague Lori, we will be managing today's webinar. We are fortunate to be joined today by Tom Keller, a Pennsylvania Game Commission wildlife research biologist and coordinator of the bobwhite quail, ring-necked pheasant, and mourning dove programs here at the agency. We expect today's presentation to last about 50 minutes, followed by a question and answer period that will last about 10 to 15 minutes if time allows. To ask Tom a question during the webinar, you can type it into the Type Question Here box on the GoToWebinar control panel, which is located at the right of your screen. For those of you dialing in to listen by phone today, please note that this is not a toll-free call and you may receive a long-distance charge from your service provider. At this time, we would just like to ask that you let us know in the comments that you can hear us. We'll do a quick audio check before we get started. All right. We assume you guys can hear us because we're not hearing that you can't. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Tom. Thank you for joining us today, and if you'd like to share a little bit about yourself and your position here at the agency before we get started.
Thanks so much, Crescinda, and thank you so much for having me today, and thank you folks for taking the time to log in with us today, and we really appreciate that. Can't tell you how excited I am to get to share not only my passion for this particular species, but really the Commission's vision for how we move forward with bobwhite restoration into the future. Before I share about myself, I would like to throw out, if you're interested, we are very interested to know where you're from, so if you wouldn't mind maybe just throwing us a comment as far as what the nearest town is or township. Just interested, who's interested in bobwhite quail over all the state here. So with that, I'll kind of jump into who I am so you kind of have an idea of who's on the other side of the mic. So my name is Tom Keller, as Crescinda had said, and I work as the bobwhite quail, the wild pheasant, and the mourning dove biologist here for the Pennsylvania Game Commission. And I've had that position here for a little bit of time. Before that, I was a coordinator for this program, and even prior to that, I worked in the Southwest region as a biologist, kind of a catch-all biologist. Before that, I worked as a bioaid in the waterfowl section, and so I've been here just shy of 8 years, and prior to that was with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Besides that, the other thing I am is a husband and a father, and I have a 8-year-old girl. She's about to be 9, and we also are third-generation farm owners in Cumberland County. And the reason I'm telling you all that is because when my mother lived on that farm, and she was 8 years old, she can still remember having bobwhites cross the driveway or flush out of a field as she walked through the fields in the summertime. And so that just tells you we're not that far away from when we lost bobwhite quail here in Pennsylvania. We're really only a generation or two away. And so my goal is to work to bring bobwhites back within that time period so we don't lose any generations that have not seen or heard quail. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about today, which is primarily go over the biology of the bobwhite, talk a little bit about the rise and the fall of quail in Pennsylvania, talk about some past restoration efforts as well as what we're currently working on, and then talk about how this translates to where we see bobwhites going into the future. So to talk about the biology, we're actually going to look first at ID, and then we'll get into quail through the seasons. And so when we talk about bobwhites and the ID, they are sexually dimorphic, which means you can tell the male from the female. And it's easy to do that just by looking at the cheek patch or the chin strap underneath. The white is the male, and on top of this picture you can see pretty easily the male, as well as that eyebrow or eye line that comes across the top of the eye. The female has more of a buffy or a goldish color underneath with her chin and over top of that eye line. It's also the call that is probably most notable about the bobwhite quail, and that's something that I want to play for you here, and hopefully you can hear this. And it's that call that most people know the bobwhite by, whether you've ever seen one. Oftentimes people have heard them before. It's that call that the male makes during the spring when he's trying to attract females. As far as the size goes, most quail are about 10 inches in length. And they do range. They follow Bergman's rule as far as the further north latitude-wise they are larger, and the further south or closer to the equator, the smaller they are. And so in the north, we see bobwhites that are generally around the 6-ounce range. And in the south, in Mexico, we generally see bobwhites that are in the 5 to 5.2 ounce range. And that doesn't sound like a whole lot, but that does make quite a bit of difference in a bird that small. Now, genetically, thanks to technology, beforehand we used to assume that there was many subspecies of bobwhites throughout the country and throughout their range. But currently, what we know now through genetic testing is that bobwhites, whether they're from Florida, Mexico, the Midwest like Kansas, or even into the Northeast, are very similar. And so it's just considered the northern bobwhite quail. As far as lifespan goes, most quail, just like most of these gallinaceous game birds that we do a lot of research on, their lifespan is actually less than a year. And obviously you have some make it through to reproduce the next year, but oftentimes it's very short-lived. But they do have high reproduction potential. And so even though they have a short lifespan, what we see is that when conditions are correct, we see quail absolutely explode with populations, and they can refill areas that they have been extirpated from. And we've seen that just recently in Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Texas, all areas where really the limiting factor was rainfall, and they did receive the needed rain. And with that, we saw populations as high as we've ever seen historically recorded, particularly in Nebraska. So let's go through bobwhite in the seasons, and I think that'll help you get an idea of exactly some of the biology of bobwhite throughout the year and what that looks like, and make a little bit more sense if we do it this way. So in the spring, so this time of the year that we're in right now, this is the part where we see the coveys, or the flocks or small groups of bobwhite, which are called coveys. We see these break up, and we see males and females start to pair, and we see dispersal. And so the coveys break up, and over a quarter of all bobwhites actually do disperse quite a distance, over 1.2 miles, which is pretty significant, but also explains how they're able to fill in areas where previously there were no bobwhites, or where they were disappearing from. So pairs begin forming generally late March through April, and this is when you hear that iconic whistle of the bobwhite. Breeding season lasts pretty long. Breeding season actually runs from May through early September, and oftentimes, most of the time, the middle of that is generally in June, or the peak of breeding season. And more of the reproductive strategies that make them so prolific when the conditions are right is not only are some bobwhites monogamous, where you have a male and a female, and they nest and hatch off a clutch. What you also see is polygamy, and so you see polygynous birds where you have a male and multiple females. But you also see polyandrous birds, and that's where you have one female that will mate with multiple males, and she can bring off several different broods that way. And the reason being is because both adults will incubate eggs. More often than not, it's the female, but many times the male will also incubate eggs. And so what she can do is she can breed a male, get the eggs laid, and then he will incubate. She can move on to the next male, breed with him, lay eggs, incubate, and then she can even pull off a nest of her own. So there's a lot of potential there for good reproduction. These are ground nesting birds. They generally dig out shallow nests at the base of clumps of grass most often. And when we talk about nesting habitat, we'll get into that a little bit later. Most often what we mean is warm season grass fields. And it's that clump or bunch grass that we're looking for quail, and that's what they most prefer when nesting. An average clutch size is generally 12 eggs, and how it works is they will lay one egg per day, and then within 5 days of laying all of the eggs for the nest, she or he will begin incubation of the nest. There's a 23-day incubation for quail, and once they hatch, it's generally mid-July. That's the peak of hatch, although it could be anywhere from May through September or even into early October, depending on when breeding occurred. Food during this time is very scarce. Sometimes you do get some early insects, and there are some remaining seeds from the previous fall and winter, but they also will eat greens as well. Again, because they have such a good reproductive strategy, sometimes they will have multiple nests that are successful. So oftentimes birds, if they fail at a nest, they will re-nest. But quail will oftentimes re-nest after a successful nest, and they can bring off more than one brood in a year. Predation during this time is generally nest predators, and we think of that mainly as skunks and raccoons. But we also have house cats as a serious issue in Pennsylvania, and oftentimes house cats will not only disturb the nest, but will primarily kill the adult. So as we transition into summer, once the chicks hatch, and when the chicks hatch, they are very small. They're 7 grams. And when you think about it, just hold up your thumb and look at the last digit on your thumb with the nail. And that's about the size of a quail chick. They are very small, but they are precocial. And as soon as they hatch, within a day or so, they are out of the nest and on the move with the adult, and immediately bugging and looking for food. Once they leave the nest, they head for brood habitat. And when we say brood habitat, what we generally mean are annual forbs, legumes, the weedy plants that we often see along roadsides, along field edges. And these plants are most important because during that time, they are attracting insects to the ground level for the baby chicks to eat. And that is the most important thing for them to have fast growth and to grow quickly. And they do grow quickly. Baby chicks are generally flight capable by 6 weeks of age, and by 8 weeks you can actually tell the difference between the sexes. Predation during this time, when we break it down, we have mammalian predators, again, house cats, fox, sometimes bobcats, depending on where they're located. And avian predators, the number one avian predator is more than likely the Cooper's hawk, and that's what research has shown, is Cooper's hawks are very hard on bobwhites, and that's primarily year-round. But the other side of mortality are rain events, and so bobwhite chicks, because of their size, can be very susceptible to hard rain events, or if we get a cold spell and they get wet. The adults are very good at trying to protect them, and they brood them overnight or during these events, but depending on how much rain there is, it can be disastrous to a quail brood. Brood survival ranges from 45 to 60%. Oftentimes it can be a little higher or a little bit lower. And then as we transition into the fall and the chicks have reached their adult size, they begin to form coveys. And so what that means is they'll break apart. It's called the fall shuffle. They'll break apart from their family group or their family covey, and different birds will start to disperse and mix in with other coveys. And the beauty of this is what it's creating, which is genetic diversity. And so for the next breeding season, you have coveys that are mixed, and you don't have interbreeding of families from the same line. Food during this time is primarily seeds. This is a time of high abundance for quail. We have lots of seeds dropping. There's still some insects around. And from what research has shown in Pennsylvania, common ragweed is the absolute #1 food for quail when we had quail in Pennsylvania. And we see that often in other states in the mid-Atlantic and even into the Midwest there. Other important foods that we would have would be foxtail and many of the agricultural residue such as corn, beans, small grains. All these are very important to bobwhites. One of the interesting things about bobwhites is when coveys roost, they roost in a circle, and you can see that in the lower right-hand corner here. And they put their tails in and their heads out, and they roost in a circle. And what this does, it not only provides warmth as they huddle together, but it also provides enhanced vigilance. So you have birds looking in a 360-degree view. Oftentimes they'll roost in more of an open field or an open area so they can see predators coming from all around them. So it's a very important strategy for survival. The habitat, when we think of fall habitat, they are still using forb fields, again, because of all the seed source. still using some of the grass fields, but they're starting to transition more towards field edges and shrubby cover. And we'll talk a little more about that shrubby protective cover and how important that is to bobwhites. But this is the time of the year when we start to see grasses lay down, we start to see forbs die and lay down, and so they become more reliant on woody cover. Mortality during this time of the year isn't terrible, but we do see some predation similar to summer. We also see the advent of winter coming and obviously the cold weather, and that can be very detrimental to quail. When we think about home range for bobwhites, with optimal habitat, what we've seen is as small as 11 acres for a covey. And that's really, if you want to vision that, it's about 7 football fields put together. So it's really not that big of an area. But more often, the habitat is not completely optimal. And so we see an increase, and we see 37 plus acres as being more of a general rule of thumb for covey home ranges. As we transition into winter and the snow starts to fall, this is really the most difficult season for bobwhites and often many grassland bird species that don't migrate and that are resident. The habitat that bobwhites focus on in the wintertime generally is that shrubby protective cover. And what that looks like is generally high stem density, vines, lots of vines, because most of the grass in the forbs at this point are now laying on the ground. Survival can be very low during this time of the year, even as low as 10%, which is hard to believe that 90% of the population could die off, but they can still continue. For a good, sustaining, increasing population, we generally like to see at least 40% survival over time. But again, as conditions are right, we can see quail explode in some areas when that happens. Predation, they are much more exposed during this time, particularly with winter weather, especially snow and ice on the ground. They're easy to see for predators. But really, the bobwhite quail's worst enemy is not necessarily the predators, but is really prolonged or deep snow and ice. And we've seen that over time. When we have hard winters, we have really deep snow. That's when we see our populations decline rapidly all over their range, all over the United States. So with that wraps up most of the biology through the seasons, and we're going to look at Quail Range. This is a good map of Quail Range as it stands now. And you can see the darker purple is the higher density, and that's obviously out in the Midwest, down through Texas and New Mexico. And that stretches over through northern Missouri, Iowa, southern Illinois, and Indiana. There's still a good population of quail down in Florida, and then it does stretch up into northern Georgia, or southern Georgia, and then up along the Atlantic coast there. But as you can tell, if you look at Pennsylvania, it's a pretty well blank slate, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. It used to expand even further north past Pennsylvania, actually up into New York, Connecticut, and Vermont. But unfortunately, due to habitat loss and a few hard winters, we've seen it contract down to where it currently stands. But again, we have seen these recent resurges in the west, and again, that's due to high rainfall in comparison to most years at the right time of year, and creating more favorable conditions. And again, that high reproductive potential. So let's talk more about quail in Pennsylvania and what that's looked like through the ages. So we'll start with even pre-settlement and even prehistory. So before we have written record, what we do have is excavations in Native American villages and Native American food caches and dumps, and we actually find quail bones in many of these throughout some of the southeast, south central parts of Pennsylvania. And at that time, Pennsylvania was mostly forested, but we still did have some very large swaths of native grass or a barrens type habitat, particularly in the southeast and some of the south central valleys. And particularly the valley that I come from, there's been a lot of research done in the Cumberland County or Cumberland Valley that stretches from the Susquehanna and down through Cumberland County, through Franklin County, and into Maryland. And this valley was primarily a large grass valley, and whether that was kept open by large herbivores, and then when Native Americans settled, if it was primarily probably kept open through prescribed fire from Native Americans. But when we had early settlers come in, and especially early explorers, and even William Penn's journals they journal that we had very good populations of bobwhite quail in certain areas of the state. But as we look at settlement, and here this diagram on the left shows you some good examples of what settlement looked like as it crept across the state. In the early 1700s, we were just beginning to settle the southeast. And then you can see that settlement crept up through the mid-1700s and began that westward and northwestward expansion until the mid-1800s, when we had pretty well settled the entire state of Pennsylvania. And it's important to remember that when I say settled, I mean cleared just about every tree in the state, which was bad for many species but was excellent for bobwhites, because as they cleared those trees, they began to farm, or at least make an attempt at farming. And what that did is that drew the bobwhites right along with the settlers, and we saw bobwhites expand what was thought in all 67 counties in Pennsylvania, which is amazing if you've ever spent any time in the north central region lately and seen what the forests look like up there. And so from that time, though, Pennsylvania did what it does best, which is grow trees. And so as the trees began to come back, the settlers gave up some of the harder to farm ground in the north central, along the lower highlands. Those trees grew back, and that pushed the bobwhite back down to the south central and along the western border, the southeast. The western border with Ohio is also good agricultural country that's been kept open. And so that kind of limited them to those areas. But in the 1960s, we saw some recovery. There were some good federal programs out there for farmers to fallow fields and some short-term set-aside programs. And we saw that with our pheasants as well. And many of our farmland species were able to benefit. Fortunately, those went away in the early 70s. And from the early to mid-70s through the 1990s, we've seen a rapid decline in quail numbers and many other species that relied on this habitat. And in 2013 and 2014, we conducted surveys to look for any remaining populations of wild quail, and unfortunately did not find a bird. And so they were deemed extirpated in 2014 from Pennsylvania. Just to kind of back that up with some statistics here and kind of looking at some easy to see trends, we see our quail harvest, which we have quite an extensive database for, started in 1915 with that data, and you can see how it grew in the 1920s into the early 30s, but then fell off again into the 40s. And some of that was directly related to some harsh winter, but also what we'll talk about is the advent of clean farming through that time. Then we see a pretty good dip, but then again in the 60s we see some programs that come in and help that population increase, but then slowly decrease as those programs have went away to almost zero here in the early to mid-90s and beyond. We see that again reflected in the number of quail hunters, and we don't have data that goes too terribly far back, but at least to 1979. And this starts this slow decline until the early 1990s, where we have almost zero quail hunters. And most of the quail hunters that have persisted are just hunting propagated quail. And so why are they gone? And this is really the hard question, or the crux of the whole matter. And it's an important one to think about. And primarily it's habitat loss. I mean, this is really for a species that is totally dependent on this grassland, shrubland, and obviously tied to agriculture type of habitat, and a species habitat specialist like the bobwhite, habitat loss is just completely detrimental for the population. Part of that is the clean farming. We see these technology gains over time, and you can see that in the pictures on the right. We start out with hand tools, and then we move to horse-drawn implements, and then we move to tractors in the 30s and 40s, and then becoming completely mechanized as of today. And efficiency has increased, and our speed has increased. And so that's really, really hard on any species that are trying to use agricultural lands at this point. And development helps drive that. We see a lot of development coming into agricultural areas. Obviously, it's cleared. It's usually flat. It's good soil, and it's easy to build houses and buildings on, warehouses. And so much of that's getting bought up and developed. And so a lot of the good ground is gone. And so farmers are not only trying to farm what they had, but they can't get any more land. And so they're trying to farm it with more productivity by removing fence rows, woodlots, and even covering up exposed rocks with soil to try to get plants on top of that, take advantage of it. So that's really hard to compete with if you're a species that's very dependent on wildlife. A lot of that has also gone to chemical agriculture, and what we see in the use of pesticides and herbicides, to the point where we're creating these large open spaces that are complete monocultures with one particular species, whether that be corn or soybeans. And even then, there's no insects within that area either. So it provides very little benefit to most wildlife that are dependent on what we would consider farmland or grassland habitat. The other side of that is pen-reared or propagated bird stocking. And so many years, private individuals have released a lot of bobwhite quail, and even today we see over 60,000 quail released annually within the state. But also the Game Commission at one time propagated a lot of quail, upwards of 10 to 20,000 per year, and we're stocking these over top of wild quail. And you get that genetic dilution, which causes weakness for the wild quail population, and that makes them less fit and less able to survive and compete out in the wild. So that's kind of some of the information as to why they're gone and why we lost bobwhites over time. But I don't want you to think that I hate farming or have anything against that. Farming is obviously very important, and certainly important to our family in particular. But I want to read you two quotes from Aldo Leopold, who's often thought to be the father of modern wildlife management. And one is about farming. He says, "There are two spiritual dangers in not owning a farm. One is the danger of supposing breakfast comes from the grocery, and the other that heat comes from the furnace." And what that really talks about is just our kind of unplugging from how things really work and from where things really come from, and how much work is put into our food that's on the table every day. And so I think just that disconnection is what he's speaking about. But another quote he gave was, "We abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect." And so I think we've seen that where land is abused to the point as it's a commodity, it belongs to us, but we've lost that touch with that community that we're all a part of. And I think what he's trying to say is we need to find that balance between the two and try to provide good habitat for wildlife while we're providing ourselves with good food. So let's talk quickly about some of the past restoration efforts for bobwhites. In the late 80s and just prior to the 90s, we had tried some bobwhite restoration. This was primarily focused down in Adams County on Game Lands 249. It was a very low stocking rate. We brought less than 100 birds in, released them. We did some monitoring. We did see some short-term success, but in the long run, it was eventual decline, and they winked out again. A lot of that was primarily because there was minimal habitat management. And we see that in these other out-of-state efforts. There's been a lot of moving quail around, a lot of translocation efforts within states, and trying to bring birds back. But unfortunately, a lot of these efforts are not tied to good quality habitat management over time and making sure that habitat's where it needs to be before we release birds into that. But I guess the question then is, why keep trying? You know, we lost quail. We let them slip out the back door, and really most people didn't notice. So what's the point of trying to bring them back? And I want to read one more quote from Aldo, and I'll leave it at that. But he says, "We shall never achieve harmony with the land any more than we shall achieve absolute justice or liberty for people. In these higher aspirations, the important thing is not to achieve, but to strive." And so he's obviously making ties here with some of our human injustice that we continue to strive towards. But it's the same with wildlife. We'll never make complete, perfect wildlife habitat, but it doesn't mean we don't need to try. And this is one of those species that we certainly need to put the effort into. This isn't just a popular game bird that disappeared. This is a native bird species to Pennsylvania, and it's beloved by many Pennsylvanians, whether we hunt or we don't hunt. There's a lot of love for bobwhites. And there's a lot of other examples of other species throughout the state that we have lots of now, and at one time we had very little or none of that we've brought back successfully. So I believe this is a perfect time to begin this restoration of bobwhite quail. There's a few other reasons, though, why we need to focus on bobwhites, and here's just a smattering of other species that are reliant on very similar habitat to bobwhite quail. It's this grassland, shrubland type habitat, and this habitat is the most endangered habitat in Pennsylvania at this point. We have very little of it, and you can tell when you look at the trends in these species populations, they're all going downhill or have flatlined, and so it's very important that we manage this habitat. And the reason that bobwhites are such an important part of this is because they can act as an umbrella. Everybody knows the bobwhite, everybody knows the call, most people are familiar with it. Again, we still have a generation that remembers bobwhite quail growing up, and so they don't just benefit, the project is not just to benefit bobwhites, but to benefit many other species that are struggling, like pollinators and a lot of non-game birds, but also game species such as turkeys and rabbits and many other species that will benefit from this habitat that we're creating for bobwhites. So what we've done as an agency is we've created a management plan for the state of Pennsylvania, and this was created in 2011. And the first goal of that, this was before we had realized that bobwhites were extirpated, was to determine where we had existing populations and try to protect those populations. But like I said, we had done some pretty stout surveys and covered a lot of the historic areas where we had quail, where we last thought we heard quail, some areas where folks were still hearing quail, and we did not find any wild quail throughout the state. So the next goal was to develop a habitat model to see, well, maybe we don't have any habitat, or maybe we do, and maybe we need to focus on those areas, and establish a bobwhite quail focus area. So select an area where we could do intense habitat management, and then eventually translocate or bring back birds from out of state, wild birds, and stock those in a bobwhite quail focus area. And that's where we're at now. We selected a location, which we'll talk about here shortly, and we're trying to establish and maintain that habitat that's crucial for bobwhite quail to exist in. And eventually, once that habitat's in place, the goal is to bring wild populations back through trap and transfer from outside of the state. But before we get too far, we need to talk about what is a bobwhite quail focus area. And this is based on research that's done from a collaboration called the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative. And this collaboration is 25 different state agencies, and I represent Pennsylvania on the NBCI board, that are working together to try to bring bobwhites back on a range-wide scale. And so what we've learned from a lot of research over the years is that we need at least 1,500 acres of year-round quail habitat. And the important part of that is year-round. So when we think about agricultural landscapes, most of that is not year-round habitat. But the important part of a focus area is to get that habitat restored and then maintain it. So quail habitat is on generally a 3-year disturbance cycle, and so it takes a lot of maintenance to keep it at that early successional stage that quail require. And then continue monitoring, not just birds to see how we're doing, but also to monitor the habitat and make sure that it's correct. The next step would be to start with a population of at least 800 wild quail. And so what research has shown is that you need 800 birds to have a self-sustaining population, and that would be the minimum of our goal when we conduct translocation from outside of Pennsylvania. And the last really important part of this is a long-term commitment from whoever the landowner might be. The research portion will last 10 years, but we hope to have this in perpetuity, and so we're hoping for a partner that would commit to us long-term. We have found that. The other thing we need to cover before we get too far down the road is also habitat. And so we generally classify this in what we call the big three, or the three most important parts of quail habitat. The first of those is nesting habitat. And we did talk a little bit about the clump or bunch warm season grasses and why that's important. Not only does it provide good nesting structure, but it also provides good overhead cover as far as a very low overhead canopy of grass to hide quail as they move around underneath it. The other part of that is it needs to have some bare ground, and so you can't have too much thatch build up when you think of the size of a quail, and it needs to be able to move around underneath that to look for food as well. It also cannot be too thick, and what we've seen in some areas, and we'll talk about it, is switchgrass. We have a lot of that on game lands, and it's excellent pheasant habitat, and we've seen that even in our wild pheasant recovery areas. It's been extremely important in our wild pheasant recovery areas, but it does not translate well to bobwhite quail. The next part of this big three is the brood cover, and brooding cover is what we think of as our forbs, our annual weeds, things like ragweed and foxtail and partridge pea. There's a lot of things out there that can act as brood cover, but it's things that are drawing insects down to the ground level. But it also will provide year-round food through seed production. And so we want a lot of forbs when we talk about quail cover, because that's going to be what keeps these birds alive throughout the year. It also provides that short overhead cover as well, and it's also important to remember that we need bare ground beneath that, which we can get through prescribed fire or disking on an annual basis, or even up to 3 years rotation. The last is the headquarters, and this is extremely important. We don't need as much when we think about this percentage-wise, but we still need plenty of it, because this is where quail are going to spend a lot of time, especially in the winter time, but also during the day in the summertime, to loaf and make sure that they're protected so they can relax. A lot of what this looks like in Pennsylvania is very high stem density, and some good examples of that is plum thickets, small locust regrowth, and then also probably more likely what you'll see in most places is rubus, or lots of raspberries, blackberries, and things like that. And one of the most important things with all three of these is that they are more in a patchwork quilt pattern, and so that's why we threw a quilt up here, is to kind of show you the example of what we're looking at, and I'll show you a good overhead view once we take a look at some of these examples. But making sure that all of it is nearby. And when we think about that importance, we think about our own homes. And so we don't want to go back to the days when we had to walk 50 yards out back to the outhouse, or we had to walk out to an ice house to get cured food, or to keep things frozen. You know, we're at the point now where we can walk from one room into the next. We've got a roof over our heads to protect us. We've got food at our disposal, we've got water, we have everything we need. And that's just as important for bobwhite quail as we think about them moving from space to space and staying protected and not having to expose themselves to predation or to weather. And so here's some examples here of what I'm talking about. I have the switchgrass crossed out, it's just too thick. But what we're looking at, that center picture there, is really optimal quail cover. We have forbs, we have grasses, we have bare ground underneath, but they can still move around and have some protection. And then the picture on the right is really great, both protective cover in the shrubs on the left, and then great cover as far as forbs go, and good food cover right adjacent to it, where they can move from one to the next without exposing themselves to any kind of danger. And here it is all put together. This is a site down in Kentucky called Shaker Village. And this is probably one of the best managed locations on the East Coast or in the Mid-Atlantic here for bobwhite quail. You have some smaller fields broken up by hedgerows, fence rows, small woodlots of shrubby cover. And the fields are a mix. You can see the brown is primarily warm season grasses and the green is primarily forbs. And you have that mixture. There's constant disturbance, and there's lots of protective cover for them to move about and access the majority of this area. I had mentioned it, but the next thing that we had done was create this habitat model. And so what this model is, and again, a model is just trying to help you, pardon me, make some decisions in the future as far as where to go with the bobwhite quail focus area, and to determine, do we have any suitable habitat left in Pennsylvania. So we drew up a model based on previous research, and this model shows that we do actually have some suitable habitat. You can see the majority of it is down in the south central region or the southeast region of the state, and there's actually a few spots up there in Erie County, which is strange, but I think it's true. But what's important also to look at is we overlaid the annual snowfall. And again, snowfall is not good for quail when you have high amounts of it. And so when we started to look at places where we could go with a focus area, we wanted to also look at public land. We had done our wild pheasant recovery area on private lands. That whole program was built around private lands, and we were able to make it work in some areas. But we also realized how fickle, with the way markets move up and down, particularly with commodity markets, how quickly habitat can come out. And so we wanted to look for public lands, and we overlaid a lot of our game lands and other public lands on here. And unfortunately, most of that suitable habitat did not line up with public lands, and most of it was not big enough to meet that 1,500 acres. You know, we had 140,000 acres total of suitable habitat, but when you look at it in this manner, and when you consider that Pennsylvania is 28.5 million acres total, that's really a drop in the bucket. So it really explains why we lost bobwhites in the first place, but it also gave us the challenge to select an area and start working on bringing that habitat back. And so we were very fortunate. We looked around and talked to a lot of different public landowners, and the one that we landed on and we feel was absolutely the best location was Letterkenny Army Depot down in Franklin County. Not only is Letterkenny located in Franklin County, but Letterkenny actually had some of the last known populations of quail existing. But Franklin County actually had some of the highest densities ever recorded in Pennsylvania for bobwhite quail. So we felt like this was kind of all lining up as we began those talks. We also found out that the Natural Resources Management Plan at Letterkenny included quail restoration on the facility. And so Natural Resources staff wanted to do this, but they just didn't have the resources to do it. And so when we began to talk about this and create this partnership, that was one of the fantastic parts of it, is that we could work together to provide the resources needed. So I'll give you a look at kind of what our management plan or our developing planning looked like. We developed a plan that was very comprehensive, and that ran from 2017 to 2027. That provided a lot of different things, but particularly a detailed habitat management plan, unit by unit, to where we knew what we were doing each year to create this habitat, as well as a translocation plan. And so that translocation plan was very important for planning, okay, where will we get quail? How will we trap them? How will we move them and ship them? How will we release them? And so all of that is a big part of bobwhite quail restoration and trying to think it through ahead of time. When we created these plans, we didn't just create these in-house. We created them and then we sent them out to a lot of external reviewers, and you can see here there's a lot of different states represented and a lot of different NGOs and folks that we felt would be best to review the plans and get us good feedback, as well as a lot of internal review between our different bureaus and different regions. Here's some aerial images of Letterkenny and why we feel that quail did last there so long but eventually did disappear. In the upper left you can see this is from 1938, and this is prior to Letterkenny Army Depot. So this was perfect quail habitat. We had lots of small farms, small farm fields, hedgerows, lots of fallowing going on because that was part of that agricultural regime at that time. But in 1942, Letterkenny was constructed, and most of the facility was planted with cool season grass. And so cool season grass is not particularly good for bobwhite quail and certainly not good for many other species, particularly what we've seen down there. But in 1957, it was still providing some habitat because there was some grass, some warm season grass remaining, a lot of agricultural leases still on the base, and a lot of small shrubby areas. Protective cover was still there. And we see that even into the 70s with the third picture. You can see more of a grass component. You can see a lot of protective cover still there, but it's starting to age out. And by the time you get to 2015 with this map on the right, you can see that, again, Pennsylvania did what it does best, and it grew that forest right back through that grass. And that's why we feel that quail eventually disappeared, even from Letterkenny, which had not been touched, had not seen the clean agriculture that most of the surrounding area had. It just saw succession eventually over time. Another good example of that, 1942, here you can see some of the igloos, and these are what housed the munitions down there. And Letterkenny is primarily a munitions storage facility for the United States Army. And here you can see 3 lines of igloos, a few sparse trees here and there, and then the mountain. And now on the right in 2017, same location, all you can see is that first line of igloos, and everything else is trees. And the only reason you can see that first line is because there's an ag field still existing there that has been mowed. So then we start talking about habitat management and what we're going to do to get this back. It's certainly a lot of work, and creating quail habitat is a lot of work. It's constant maintenance, but it's really important if we want to bring bobwhites back that we do this the right way, and we don't go halfway like a lot of other projects have gone for bobwhite quail throughout their range. And so it's important that we do it the right way, and we follow our management plan, and we follow the advice of many other quail biologists throughout the country. And so here you can see some examples of what we're doing, and we'll talk more about those here in another slide or two. But the first thing that we did was develop a cover map. We needed to know where we were at to start and where we wanted to go. And so on the left you can see in the pea green color or the yellow color we have a lot of woodland there. That's a lot of that. Trees had come back and succeeded over the grass, and a lot of that needed to come down. We have very little open cover, which was even cool season grass. And you can see where we want to go is primarily forbs and annual weeds. So get that forb component back. That'll be over 57% of what we want. And then the other is the warm season grass, just about 9%, and then up to the shrubby cover, which is around 11%. And so the shrubby cover are those brown lines that run everywhere, along with some patches there. And again, mixing it all together like a patchwork quilt is very, very important. The total acreage for our focus area is about 3,600 acres, and so that's what we're focusing on down at Letterkenny. So some of the different treatments that we've been working on is overstory removal, again getting those trees on the ground to open that up to sunlight and try to promote some of the forbs and warm season grasses. Prescribed fire, which we've done quite a bit of burning down there, and actually as we speak there's conducting a prescribed fire down at Letterkenny today. Part of that overstory removal has been a timber sale. We have a 1,400 acre timber sale occurring right now as well. And then disking. And disking is an extremely important part of that disturbance cycle and trying to open up bare ground, promote forb growth, promote these annual weeds growing. And lastly, herbicide. And responsible herbicide management is extremely important in providing good habitat management, especially when trying to get things established. And so here again some more photos, but you can see on the map on the right, this is a little outdated. It's from February, but so far we've easily manipulated over 2,000 acres down there. That doesn't mean it's suitable habitat. That just means we're working towards it at this point. You can see in the pink there is our prescribed fire areas. The purple is our timber sale that we're moving through. The green is where we've done volunteer cutting with hand saws, chainsaws, and then a lot of disking in the black as we move through. And then we have some herbicide treatment in there as well. Just want to give you a few examples of kind of some of the changes that we've seen. These are photo points that we use to document changes over time, and that's important when we're looking back to see how different treatments have succeeded or not succeeded. Here you can see what most of the typical habitat looks like down there. It's just old fields that have reverted back to young forests, and so a lot of that we came through. You can see in the upper left there where we have cut trees, taken that overstory down, and then turned that into windrows, which actually provides temporary protective cover until we get good shrubby response coming up through that. But what this has done is opened up some of these areas and promoted a lot of forb growth. So here's a stand that was taken down. Again, the trees were put into rows where we were able to provide some protective cover there in the meantime. Here's another area that was primarily trees. Those trees were cut down, and we have some really good warm season response there. And so not just the habitat management, but monitoring is also equally important. We don't want to just do management and throw quail out and say we're good to go. We actually want to know, is it really doing what we say it's going to do or what we're thinking it's doing? And so for quail, we conduct annually spring whistle counts and fall covey counts. Obviously right now there's no birds there, but it's important to get baseline data. And we'll continue this once we do get birds on site. But the other important thing is monitoring these other species that we talked about earlier. And so we have different breeding bird survey routes. We have several woodcock survey routes on site. And we also have some breeding bird survey points that we monitor. So we're continuing to monitor these. And we've seen good response already from several species like bobolinks, like eastern meadowlarks that are already coming in and using some of the habitat that we've created. So once that habitat's been established and we have our minimum of 1,500 acres of suitable habitat, we'll continue to expand, but at that point, we're going to be looking to translocate wild quail from other states. And we've already begun to work on that. We've spoken with several other states already to find out if they'd be interested in helping us. We've got a lot of positive response from other states that would be interested in helping us. So we're very grateful for that. And it's not just to bring back bobwhites to Pennsylvania. We're looking to answer a lot of important questions that quail managers have asked for many, many years. And it's becoming more important because quail are kind of disappearing in many other states as well. And some of those are, can you have quail completely extirpated and bring them back and have a self-sustaining population based on what NBCI has come up with for those needs? And also, can you bring quail from different states from around the range and have similar survival, or would you see a different survival, say from a bird from Florida or from Texas versus a bird from Kansas or Virginia? And so these are all questions that we'd like to answer as we move forward with this project. And so once that habitat's in place, we'll be working with many of our other state partners to translocate bobwhites back into Pennsylvania. Future expansion, so this is not just a one-off project. This is certainly a pilot project to get this started, and we're starting to actually move out from the focus area and focus on private lands management outside of Letterkenny. Here you can see in that small circle, that is Letterkenny Army Depot, but outside of it, we have about 40,000 acres. We're going to begin to focus on private lands management to provide quail cover, because again, those quail, a certain percentage will disperse every year, and we don't want to lose those birds. We want them to thrive outside of the facility. The other thing we'd like to do in the future is use this as our stock population to create more multiple populations throughout the state. So we want to not only provide that, but we don't want to put all of our eggs in one basket. We want to try to expand that in the case that there would be a weather event or something similar that might crash a population. Here we would have another population established elsewhere. And the benefit of this is just creating more access to birds and more educational value, which I think will be extremely important as we move forward with this project. And again, we're not just managing for quail. By doing this, we're managing for many, many other species that are reliant on this specific type of habitat. With that, I want to just talk a little bit about our partnerships. Many partners have banded together to create this Keystone Quail Restoration Initiative. And you can see here we have two different universities, Shippensburg and Harrisburg. Both have provided staff and resources to help us move this project forward. We have a Quail Forever Big Covey chapter, and Quail Forever out in Western PA has made a substantial donation to the project. And the Cumberland Valley Pheasants Forever chapter has also made a substantial donation to the project. And Renfrew Institute has always helped us get the good word out. So we're always looking for more partners, but we're just so grateful for those that have come on board and made this move forward with us in Letterkenny. So I just want to challenge you before I go to ask the question of yourself, what can I do? And I would encourage you just to be what I would call a conservation hero. You know, you don't have to own a farm. If you do, that's great. And you know, if you can, put some ground in habitat for wildlife or for pollinators. But even if you have a flower pot, you can plant a milkweed. There's so many things that you can do to help. And even one milkweed plant in the middle of a city is extremely beneficial to the pollinators that are really struggling right now. So I just want to encourage you to do that. There's so many things we can do. We can help others. We can help educate. There's so many things that each one of us are talented with that we can do to move things forward. If this project's something specific that you're interested in and you want to get involved, we do have volunteer opportunities. And again, we're always looking for help to get the word out on the project and on quail restoration throughout the state. So just if you're interested, we'll provide an email at the end. Please get a hold of me. I'd be happy to talk with you and see how we can work together. And the other side is to donate. If that's something you're interested in, this project in particular, we have had private donations come in, and if you feel strongly about it, we'd encourage that. But if not, just again, be a conservation hero yourself and get out there and make a change on your side of the world. And with that, I just want to leave you with a quote from Theodore Roosevelt. Again, probably one of the greatest conservationists this country's ever seen, because of the position that he held and because of some of the things that he did before leaving office. I recognize the right and duty of this generation to develop and use the natural resources of our land, but I do not recognize the right to waste them or to rob, by wasteful use, the generations that come after us. We have fallen heirs to the most glorious heritage a people ever received, and each one must do his part if we wish to show that the nation is worthy of its good fortune. I just want to encourage you to remember that every one of you are the stewards of our wildlife resource. We are all stewards of that. No one person owns the resource. The Game Commission certainly does not, but we're tasked with managing it, and I just ask that you would consider that and consider what you can do for the wildlife resource, not just for today, but for future generations into the future. And with that, I'll turn it back to Crescenda and take any questions if we have some time.
All right, we have one question so far.
What is the warm season grass mixture?
Yeah, what is the warm season grass mixture on project?
Yeah, so excellent question, and we do get that quite a bit, is what would be a good mixture. What we're actually seeing is we're not doing any kind of planting. The seed source, the native seed source here at Letterkenny is incredible. Most of those flower pictures that I took were from Letterkenny, and we have excellent warm season response when we burn, when we apply herbicide to the cool season, from what we see come back. And so mostly what we have is big blue and little blue, big blue stem and little blue stem coming back. And that little blue stem is an excellent cover because it will stand up over the winter. The big blue does get knocked down, and so we do generally conduct annual prescribed fire to burn the thatch off and allow that to come back. So at this point, thankfully, it's been saving us quite a bit. We don't actually have to do any kind of planting there.
All right, awesome. That's the only one that we had submitted, but if you have additional questions, you can email us directly at pgccomments@pa.gov, and we will forward them along to Tom to get you some answers. So we're going to put some contact information up on the screen here that you should be able to see. Yeah, so there's the email address if you have any other questions, and a link about some more information about the northern bobwhite quail. So thank you, Tom, so much for this information today. A lot of great stuff, and we're out of time, unfortunately, but this has been a great session with lots of important information and great questions from you. This webinar has been recorded, and you will receive an email with a link of the recording within the next few days. The recording will also be uploaded onto the Game Commission's YouTube channel, where captions will be auto-loaded and edited for you to view. I'd like to thank Tom again for sharing his experience and time with us today. We'd also like to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us this afternoon for this webinar, and we hope you'll visit us again to learn more about Pennsylvania wildlife in upcoming webinars. Until then, we hope you're able to get outside and enjoy some of Pennsylvania's great outdoors. Thanks for joining us.